Good afternoon. I'm glad that I'm with you and that we're together without a strike. Um, I don't think there will be a strike. There's going to be a vote uh, of the union as to whether or not to accept the settlement. I think that the vote will be against the strike. I could be wrong, but um, I don't. I think we can more or less count on proceeding smoothly to the end of term. Um, I want to note that the settlement having been reached, I sent in the final exam, and the final exam, basically, as you'll recall, consists of 9 questions. It will cover the questions that I've discussed in class, and as we've gone along, I've been basically going through the review questions, and we will have the last class will be, and I hope you'll sort of gather your thoughts. The answers that I've given are recorded online. So if you have some questions about your own answers, you just go back to through the lectures and find the answers that I give at the beginning of each class. And then you can bring, if you have any, you want me to elaborate more on some answer in the last class, this is what I'll do. Now, furthermore, there is the whole question of you're going to get an email asking you to evaluate the course and so on. If you would fill that out and send it back in, I guess it could be helpful. Although, to tell you the truth, I'm rather pissed off at the administration about these evaluations, because really, to develop this course online, I've spent the whole summer working my ass off, and so have most of the faculty. We're killing ourselves, and these guys on top controlling everything, telling us we're going to be evaluated by these people who don't do any teaching, etc. This is the way I feel about it. It's an outrage, basically. So that's basically what I have to say at the moment. I want your feedback now. Are there things that concern you about the way things are developing? We can have a little discussion here. Take turns, but please, if you're perplexed, raise the issue now. Okay. Now, over the weekend, I sent this little piece that appeared in the student newspaper at the University of Michigan, which is a major American university, and it gives you, I sent it because I thought it was a good piece, and it gives you a sense, basically, as you may have figured out by now, my approach to things. Marx and Marxism plays a big role in the way I look at things, but it helps to see that I'm not sort of coming out of this from nowhere. This is the developing trend in university studies throughout the world, in the United States, and in Canada. And so this is what I'm giving you. Obviously, you don't want to believe me. Let's take seriously the statement that's made here that Marx, one of the things he says right at the beginning, he says that it is, in order to truly understand the world, you have to subject knowledge to ruthless criticism, the ruthless criticism of everything that exists. And that is my approach. I adopt that approach. That is to say, everything is subject to criticism. There is no exception. including me, that is your responsibility. You have to carefully evaluate and criticize what I'm saying. And you have to do the same to yourself. You have to subject yourself to the same kind of criticism. What are your prejudices? Where you come from? What are your hangups? What are the barriers to full understanding of things as the way they are? In other words, is a kind of self-reflexive approach to learning, to knowledge, including self-knowledge, which is at the very root of really getting at a true understanding of this world that we inhabit, which of course is in upheaval. So with that little sermon having been said, I'm now going to move on and first of all deal with the next review question, which I believe is 20, and basically asks you to discuss the reasons why in India dissent generally took a religious form. Why was religion so important that it even those people who found themselves in dissent, and mainly they came from the lower classes, expressed themselves not in secular form but in religious form. Well, I would say that India, like the Ottoman Empire, was a deeply religious culture, and that becomes clear from the very beginning, from the first writings that we have from the Vedas, way back in the Aryan period. There is some poetry, there are stories, there's a certain degree of philosophy that you see in Indian Hindu religious texts, but mainly it's all about religion. And likewise, when you get to the Muslim period, religion is all consuming, particularly because in the Muslim period, of course, there's the divide between the Muslims and the Hindus. And so religion becomes even more important. Furthermore, as a secular point of view, that is to say, a view of politics and of social and economic reality was sort of difficult to develop because economic and social life was so localized, so entrenched at the local level, including, of course, the fact that the Brahmins from already in the Iron Age begin to become, the Brahmins who are essentially religiously minded are the dominant elite in the society. So kind of the development of a secular attitude towards social and political questions was fundamentally inhibited in this kind of society. Now, in terms of answering, and you should mention the forms of dissent that did develop. And the first form that I indicated was Buddhism and Jainism, way back in the period of the empires. And the point I made there was, of course, the system of varnas, of proto-sects, was already emerging with the Brahmins at the top, and then the military men and so on, then the farmers, and then the outcasts. That was already beginning to gel. In this society, protest against this divided society took the form of kind of a religious dissent. The body, physical reality was imprisoned, but the soul was free. Buddhism and Jainism both have this idea of the freedom of the soul undercutting the caste system, undercutting the heavy weight of empire. The soul, nevertheless, and in the case of Buddhism, it transmigrates. It's free. It can move through many different life forms until it reaches the form of infinite bliss. So there's a kind of compensatory religious freedom as against the reality of social and political imprisonment. And then, of course, with the Muslim conquest, with the Mughals in the 16th century, you have Bhakti emerging, which is a monotheistic, in contrast to Hinduism, which is polytheistic. Bhakti is this kind of personalized religion, steeped in mysticism, steeped in the idea that one can have a direct communion with God. It's expressed in the vernacular. It's anti-ritualistic. It's anti-caste. The first of these Bhakti practitioners was Kabir, then the founder of Sikhism, Nanak, and then a whole series of other religious teachers who came from the lower classes. Most of them were craftsmen who didn't have the training of the Brahmins and so on, and indeed rejected it. Didn't know Sanskrit, the religious language. This was a faith of the common people. And we see that it formed the basis of, as the Mughal Empire became more repressive in the 17th century, culminating with Aurangzeb, who was a real tyrant. He did conquer most of India, and he destroyed the last independent Hindu kingdom, but because of his religious persecutions and excessive taxations, all sorts of protests emerged on the part of the Sikhs, on the part of the Jats, on the part of the Maratha Confederacy, on the part of the Satnamis in northern India. And lo and behold, we see that this Bhakti religion plays a big role in this form of protest. It's not secular, it's not based on class, it's based on religion. So that would be the way to answer this question. So having looked at that now, this next question, we'll try to do one question every day, moving right along through the rest of the review question. I want now to turn back to the demise of the Mughals, the triumph of the English in India, and then look at China, begin to look at China. So, well, we've already seen that under Aurangzeb, although his rule was tyrannical, it ended in a rebellion. And by the end of his reign, the empire began to break into parts, into pieces. And we see here, if I can get rid of this, well, this will do as well. Here you see on the left, oh, here it is. By the first few years after the reign of Aurangzeb, the sultans still exist in Delhi. The Mughal emperor is still there, but the whole place is divided into you see all these different states that have emerged, more or less informally. They've declared their independence from the emperor. And there was a lot of, as a result, there was a lot of warfare between these different states. And some say, previously, historians believed, well, this was a catastrophe, basically a big catastrophe. But some historians today take a different view and claim that being free of the Mughal Empire, some of these little states, especially on the coast, actually prospered during the 18th century. And they'll even argue that perhaps capitalism could have emerged in India if the British hadn't taken over. I doubt whether this is the case. At the village level, there was still this local economy. The Brahmins were still intact, and things were still frozen And so I don't see capitalism emerging in the wake of the fall of the Mughal Empire. But in any case, we can say that the weakness of these small states and their divisions opened the way for the growing presence of the Europeans, and of course, eventually the English took over. Now, let's look at the big picture, the big global picture in that light, because we're now at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century. What was going on in the world in general? Well, the biggest thing that was happening was, of course, the wars of Louis XIV. You'll recall a while back, we discussed this. Louis XIV trying to basically dominate all of Europe, and the English, based on their capitalism, had the means. They had the economic means. They were able to field big armies and navies. They were able to lend money to other European powers. And as a result of that, the English created this anti-French coalition and became the dominant power in the West Indies, in West Africa, in the Mediterranean. By the end of the wars of Louis XIV, 1715, he dies. England is the dominant power in Europe and the dominant power globally. Now, in terms of what was going on in Asia, we look at things at the beginning of at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century. We can say that, of course, the Europeans were present, but Asian merchants were not under the control of the Europeans or the English at this stage. No, the Europeans, the English were more important, but they were still not able to dominate the trade of Asia. On the other hand, we do see the fact that in the first place, the Portuguese have more or less been eliminated as a factor. By the beginning of the 17th century, the Dutch take over Indonesia, or it's called the Spice Islands, displacing the Portuguese. Likewise, the Dutch have taken over Sri Lanka, south of India, taken it away from the Portuguese. The Portuguese are basically left with Goa, this little enclave, which of course they keep for forever till 1975, and also Macau on this little trading post on the edge of China, which they keep really until the 1970s as well. But for the most part, the Dutch have displaced the Portuguese. And they are the dominant power in European power in Asia. Now, the English at this point want in. They have created what, in imitation of the Dutch, the English East India Company. There was first the Dutch East India Company, and now we have the English East India Company. And in the 1620s, they made a serious bid. They went to war against the Dutch, trying to oust them from the Spice Islands, from Indonesia. But the English at this point didn't have as many ships as the Dutch, didn't have as much money as the Dutch, and their attempt collapsed in the 1620s. And so the Dutch remained intact, and the English actually suffered a defeat initially in Indonesia, and for a while they laid low. They concentrated no longer on military and political ambitions, but rather strictly kept their activities commercial and economic. And they focused on India more or less exclusively. The rest of Asia, they ignored. And using the English East India Company, which as I explained, these companies were limited liability companies. They were based on shareholders in a board of directors, um, and they basically were the first corporations. Obviously, there was some difference between modern corporations and these early corporations, but they were, in their essence, very similar. Of course, the Hudson's Bay Company was one of the companies that was created in England, I know. In any case, the English concentrated on founding as many trading posts along the coast of India as they could. And basically, they spent their time trading with the local merchants, um, obeying the local rules of these different rulers, um, political cooperation and getting the protection and permission from the local rulers was important. And the main thing that they were concerned with, above all, these English merchants, was the fact that back in Europe and back in England, um, the public, the consuming public, which would mean the upper classes, the merchant class, and even the wealthy craftsmen, a rage for cotton goods from India developed in the second half of the 17th century and through the first part of the 18th century. And these English merchants concentrated on supplying these cotton goods, which were used for clothing, but also they were used to basically provide curtain goods, as well as furniture, covering of furniture by use of cotton. So cotton was extremely popular. It was a real change from wool and silk. And it meant that there was a constant English and European trade balance with India, not to speak with China, of course, China as well, but we'll get to that. Now, by the middle of the 18th century, the English had no less than 150 trading posts all along the coasts of India, exporting mainly cotton, but also exporting silks, sugar, rice, saltpeter, opium, and in exchange, they basically provided these Indian merchants with gold. The English were not able to sell virtually any English products, maybe some zinc and lead, but there did develop a certain market in India and elsewhere in Asia for European weapons. The Europeans, in terms of their military technology, their rifles, their pistols, their cannon, were superior to anybody else. Although I made the point that, of course, these things existed in Asia, were made in Asia, but they were not as good as the European models. Now, as I explained, India was divided. There was a lot of warfare between these different states. And essentially, India was open to conquest. And the occasion of the conquest came during one of these European wars back in Europe. Once again, the French and the English were at war. These were essentially commercial wars, and we're at the war, the so-called 7 Years' War, which was in many ways decisive, between 1756 and 63. As you know from your high school, it's during this war that Canada passed into the hands of the English. Likewise, basically, the English got control of the West Indies fully, and they got control of Latin America as a result of this war. So it was important. And India, likewise, fell to the English because at the opening of the war, of course, the English as I've explained, had a strong presence, but so too did the French. The French had created their own French East India Company, and its headquarters was located in the south of France, south of India, in this region here. And so the English and French are warring all over the world, in the New World, in Europe, but also in India. And during this conflict, the English East India Company got into a fight not only with the French, but with the Nabob of Bengal. The Nabob, that's a name of a coffee, I guess, in Canada, a not very good coffee. The company up until this point had done business with the Nabob. He was the dominant political ruler. This is where the French are located. But at this point, the Nabob began to restrict the activities of the English in Bombay, in Calcutta, which was the main trading post of the English. And so the English declared war. They wanted to get rid of the Mughal. And the Mughal appealed to the French for help. As I say, they were located in the south in a place called Pondicherry. And they the French sent forces into Bengal to help the Nabob. And this big battle developed between the Nabob, the French, on the one hand, and the English army, who allied themselves against the Nabob with some zamindars, allied themselves with the English. Some of these local agents rebelled against the Nabob and joined the English. Well, there was this big showdown at a place called Plassey, Battle of Plassey, and the English won this battle. They displaced the Nabob and took direct control of Bengal, which is, of course, very rich, and subordinated the French, right? The French East India Company became subordinate to the English as a result. Now, the company decided that they would pursue this conquest. They would continue. And so between 1757 and 1818, the company, it's a private company, proceeds to raise armies, and at the same time allying with some of the local princes, dividing the Indian rulers from one another, using a certain politics of division, against some substantial resistance. There was resistance. The Indians didn't simply passively accept this situation. Nevertheless, between 1757 and 1818, the English East India Company conquered India. And the profits that this conquest produced for the shareholders and for the officers of the company are not to be believed. They were enormous. A private company had basically conquered a whole continent. And as a result, there was an immense plunder, plundering. Huge taxes were imposed on the local populations. Many of the temples and palaces were plundered for their valuables, and enormous private fortunes were made by the officers of the company, by some of the officers in the armies of the English East India Company um, as a result. And much of this gold and revenue found its way back to England. Uh, Many of the great country houses that you see if you visit the English countryside today were built during this period and were built by basically the people who made these enormous fortunes um, out in India and at the expense of the Indian population. And beyond that, of course, England was getting rich in other ways as well. Of course, the Industrial Revolution was going on right at that period, but the plunder from India helped to finance the Industrial Revolution. It went into the banks, and the banks loaned it out to the cotton manufacturers in England and the other manufacturers. So this capital that was plundered in India found its way into the Industrial Revolution. Furthermore, England was at war with France, as we've seen, and all of these wars that they had from the time of Louis XIV right through the 18th century culminated, of course, after 1789, the French Revolution and Napoleon, which were, the wars were enormous, very expensive. Well, England had plenty of money, and a lot of the money that was used to finance the war came from India. And of course, the war, the English proved to be victorious, and the English emerged as absolutely the global power as a result of all of this. Now, looking at the effects of all of this on India, the story is not so bright. It's the dark side of what happened. This is obviously this plundering went on at the expense of the Indian population, but also noteworthy is the fact that the English, once they had control after 1818, they began to attack the Indian cotton industry. I explained how important this was to India, this cotton industry. It's true, its mode of production was relatively primitive. You're talking about hand manufacture for the most part. But nevertheless, it was a very substantial industry for tens, hundreds, millions of people in India. Well, the English now had, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, had their own their own cotton. They excluded by tariffs Indian cotton from England, and they jigged things in such a way that English manufactured cotton had the advantage even in the Indian market. And as a result, in the course of the 19th century, the Indian cotton industry basically disappeared as a result. Furthermore, they fundamentally changed the legal system in India once they took control, and I explained to you the whole system of imperial control at the top, the extraction of surplus, the fact that the economy was localized, a barter economy between peasants and craftsmen. All of this it didn't completely disappear, but it was undermined because the English, from about the 1830 onwards, introduced private property. Private property really didn't exist until this moment. Private property and a system of landlords developed based on classes. Private property and land, a landlord system which had not existed previously, now became the basis of things. That was certainly in the immediate a downside effect because it created economic insecurity. On the other hand, um, uh, and they did entrench a landlord class. On the other hand, they also created a middle class, which was a very positive thing for the times. They did that by basically creating a modern educational system in India and by creating the Indian National Railway. They built the railway system in India to move their troops all over the country. But they politically and economically unified India through they created a national market. So you have the national market helps the Indian bourgeoisie, the Indian middle class. Likewise, a modern education system. So that in the long term was a good thing. So landlordism and insecurity and growing misery on the one hand, but on the other hand, the creation of a middle class, which is ultimately going to liberate India. But to conclude all of this, to give you an idea of the overall effect of the British on India, let me note that at the time of the conquest in 1757, India produced 26% of the world's gross domestic product. We know this because these very sophisticated economists that we have today in the world can do the numbers. And they've established that a little bit more than a quarter of the world GDP was produced in India. Of course, it had a huge population. At the time of the British conquest in 1757, at the time of Indian independence, 2 centuries later, in 1949, India got its independence. At that time, India produced 4% of the world's GDP. You can see the decline. The English did. They used India as a big market, as they used the tax revenues, they sent them back to England. They basically bled the Indians white. They used the Indians as soldiers in all of their wars. The British could rely on the Indian soldiers to back up the British Army. And so India, overall, the balance is not good. That is what I would conclude. And of course, since independence, India has had an independent economy, and of course, a vigorous capitalist economy with accompanying misery, I want to add, has and continues to develop in India. Are there any questions or queries about what I said? This concludes what I have to say about India. We're turning to China now. Anybody want some clarification or to say something about what I've said? Okay, so let me now turn to China. China, as you know, is, according to the United States, looking at the things today, and Canada, China is the enemy, as we know. China is bad. Of course, once upon a time, China was a close ally of the United States and Canada. I'm talking about World War II. And in fact, through much of the 19th and early 20th century, until the communists took over, China was, in Canada and the United States, was the object of much sympathy during that period. In any case, today, China is the enemy. So we need to know more about this so-called enemy. First of all, Chinese civilization is hugely old. It originated more or less at the same time as Indian civilization, 2700 BC, generally taken as the date. Remember that The date in Egypt is about 3100, and in Mesopotamia 3500 BC for civilization. And from then on, it has a continuous history. The first recording of its history comes in 1600 BC. The first historians, the Chinese were very good historians, unlike the Indians. They began to read that we have a continuous history by reign of China, and some Chinese histories are excellent during this imperial period. Very old and very interesting histories were written from 1600 BC onward. Now, at the time of the Roman Empire, we know that the Roman Empire unified the West. All of the West around the Mediterranean and the Middle East was unified under the Roman Empire, dating this period from roughly 200 BC to 200 AD. Well, the same thing happened in China. All of China was unified, became the present territory of China, more or less, was unified under a single empire between 200 BC and 200 AD. This unification of China came about under the so-called Qin and Han dynasties that date from this period, 200 BC, Qin, C-H-I-N, Han, H-A-N dynasties at the time of the Roman Empire. Now, in the West, we have then the fall of the Roman Empire, and we have the Dark Ages in the West. Certainly in Europe, the Dark Ages, and then this sort of odd Byzantine Empire. But during the Middle Ages, China went from strength to strength, and particularly during the so-called Tang and Sung dynasties between the 7th and the 11th centuries, when no civilization existed in Europe. Between the 7th and the 11th century, China was flourishing. It was, in a way, at its height. And the technological level of China that China reached by the end of this period, by the end of the 11th century, was way higher than it was in the West. China was the most advanced country in the world. And this superiority, I would say, continued until the 17th century. It's during the 17th century that the West Europeans, the English, and then, of course, the French, the Dutch, began to catch up in the course of the 17th century with, of course, the birth of capitalism. But another thing that we should note is not only was China flourishing through most of this period, but also China was remarkable in that, like Western Europe, we should say there's a commonality, because markets were extremely important in China right throughout. Yes, we have landlords, we have noblemen, we have bureaucrats, we have the imperial court, but merchants and markets play a huge role in Chinese history. They're subordinated, they're always subordinated, but they play a huge role. And we see that during the 13th century, the so-called Silk Road, merchants crossed the whole of the Eurasian continent with their silks and their porcelain and their spices from China, and were doing business in the West. The famous Silk Road, which the Chinese are busy recreating today under a new form, was created during the 13th century. So it was the center of world commerce. It had this elaborate technology, and it was politically and socially very sophisticated. So much so that you see that the inventions fundamental to Western development that came into being during the Renaissance in Europe gunpowder, printing, the compass, and also new agricultural implements to increase the output of food, all came in from China. So this is why we need to sort of look at this. Things began to go badly in the course of the 18th century, as you will learn. Things turned for the worse from the late 18th century onwards, and China fell into chaos and was invaded by the West in the 19th century, and was thoroughly humiliated and dominated by the West, and internally was in a miserable condition. And until finally China was liberated in 1949 with the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, things turned around. Now, of course, today, during the Cold War, China, of course, was extremely hostile to the West and vice versa. The West, the Americans tried to isolate China. It didn't do any good. And with the Vietnam War, Nixon decided to open up relations with China from 1971 onwards. Especially commercial and economic relations developed. And the hope of the Americans was that they basically could control Chinese development and subordinate it within their global imperial system. But alas, it didn't work out that way. By the beginning of the new millennium, China had emerged as a rival to the United States. And given the fact that China has 4 times the population of the United States of America, given the fact that it has a system of public education, which is in some ways, I would say, certainly not I wouldn't say that the universities in China are quite at the level that you see in the United States, but at the level of primary education, high school education, the level of education is superior to that in the United States. In fact, as you probably know, a lot of education at that level in the United States is inferior. There's a kind of 2-tier system of education in the United States. Well, that's not true in China. And that is a huge strength, a highly educated and large population, and with a mix of public and private enterprise. The public sector dominates, but the private sector is very important. And this model seems to be giving the Chinese an advantage. Meanwhile, the West has taken alarm, and starting in the Obama period, from more or less cooperating with China, the United States has basically adopted a position of hostility towards China, which of course culminated with Trump. But this is a policy of the American elites. It's not simply Obama and Trump. No, the American elites have taken this because they feel that their weakening economic position, they still have military strength, of course, and even financial strength, but from an economic point of view, the Chinese are gaining ground day after day. And of course, Canada is simply tagging along. You probably know about the Huawei case and so on. I'm not going to go into that. In any case, this is the situation as it stands today, and we don't know how it's going to turn out. But what we need to do is carefully, because there is a continuity. Certainly there was a revolution in 1949, but and it changed a great deal, but certain fundamental characteristics of Chinese society need to be understood. They developed in the imperial period, and we're going to proceed to examine these things in the next lecture. So bye-bye until Wednesday.